so excited about how many of you signed up for the event. I think we had over 400 people show an interest, which for us at INTRAC is shows the relevance maybe of the topic, but also what a great network we have. And it's really exciting for me to be hosting this event. This is my first sort of external event that I'm hosting as part of INTRAC. I joined a couple of months ago, and it's our second event as part of celebrating 30 years anniversary of INTRAC. As we've sort of started this period of reflection, if you like, looking back over our 30 years, we've been thinking about our work and how we've contributed to strengthening civil society organisations. And we've always been clear that MEL has a key role in enabling organisations of all shapes and sizes to do what they want to do better. And to this end, we've provided technical support on MEL to a variety of organisations operating in very diverse contexts. And we've continually pushed space for attention on the L, on the learning in MEL, because we believe that unless there's a focus on learning and unless there's ownership and use of MEL, processed by those involved in delivering a project, its impact is limited. But there was also a second reason for sort of focusing on MEL and putting on this event, because while we've always been interested in MEL and committed to MEL, we've also been thinking more recently what is its role in actively shifting the power? And by this, we mean how can MEL itself contribute in enabling and sustaining impactful, relevant, inclusive and equitable development or social change and justice? And what role does it play in enabling civil society organisations in the Global South to define and deliver their own justice agendas? How do partnerships and relationships across geographies play a role in this too? So in thinking about my role as chair of this event, I thought it'd be helpful to outline a few different ways we can think about MEL through the lens of shifting the power. And then I'll go ahead and introduce the great panel that we've got lined up for you today. So there are lots of different reasons, as we all know, for doing monitoring, evaluation and learning. At one end, and we often critique this, monitoring, evaluation and learning is resourced as a requirement of an externally funded project, and there's a focus on upward accountability with an aim to evidence that what was agreed in the funding contract has been delivered. Maybe at the other end of the spectrum, you could characterise a community-led initiative that's identified something that they want to do, as a group of people want to do. And there's a sort of organic, iterative approach to MEL as part of implementing a community initiative. Here it's developed by the people that are using the learning, and it's sort of part of their process of delivery, and it's integrated, it's about refining and making choices, informing sort of decision-making and adaptation in the approach. In these examples, the audience for MEL is distinct, and the motivations for MEL and the use of MEL are also distinct. So you could start by suggesting maybe shifting the power in MEL involves moving from the former type of MEL to the latter, with assumptions that the latter might be more rooted in context, more culturally appropriate and more useful. Both Franck and Sophie later in our panel will be sharing more about community-led and culturally appropriate MEL. But I think it's not enough to talk about the motivation and purpose of MEL. It's also about thinking about who's participating and what knowledge counts. In either of the examples I just gave, there might be active attention in thinking through who is participating, but also there might be different ways that their perspectives and knowledges are listened to and elicited, and also different weight given to those different people and impact on what we're learning about. So I think thinking more about this, that suggests shifting the power is not only thinking about who is doing the MEL, but also who is included, what knowledges are considered as valid. And I think that's something that Alison on the panel will talk a bit more about. There are two more dimensions that I think are important. One is how the MEL is framed and focused. Is it inward looking, just thinking about the project that's taking place, or is it outward looking, placing that work in the wider political, environmental or social and cultural context? In that first example, the community initiative might be going off track because of issues involved in those delivering the initiative, or it could be because of the wider environment in which it's being delivered and how much is known, for example, about the national political and economic context that might be impacting the local work, or bigger sort of longer term issues such as climate change. So shifting the power here could include considering how alternative knowledges and perspectives are used in deepening understanding and analysis within any MEL effort. But it's not only the sort of process of MEL, who's involved in deciding that and who's driving it, but also how its outputs are used. Are the insights and lessons shared beyond the specific project in that specific moment in time, or do they have relevance for wider strategies of change? In fact, you could argue that funder-led MEL could be the most transformative in terms of its ability to influence practice at a strategic level or influence donor design of a particular programme of work. So it's important to consider the ways that we can engage with shifting the power through the use of MEL outputs. As a sector, we're not always as good as we could be in terms of applying learning to teacher practice. And I guess going back to today and what we're trying to get out of today, a really good outcome for us at INTRAC could be identification of practical steps we could all be taking, whether we're civil society actors in the Global South, NGOs, funders, policymakers, to respond to the discussion in terms of practical changes we might make to shift power through MEL. And I look forward to some of those ideas coming forward later. So I think that's enough from me, and my role now is really to hand over to the panel, but let me just run through and introduce them. So we've got 4 people speaking today. We've got Franck Sombo, who is the head of monitoring, evaluation and learning in WACSI in Ghana, and he's going to be talking to us about community-led M&E. I'll go to Franck first. WACSI is one of INTRAC's strong allies, I would say, and partners, and Franck is the programme lead for TechSoup in West Africa, the Institute's Technology for Development programme. He graduated from a certified training of trainers in local fundraising, a part of the Change the Game Academy programme, seeking to empower grassroots organisations to mobilise resources to support their sustainability and increase their social impact. And he's going to be drawing on that as he talks about community-led MEL. After Franck, we'll go to Sophie Kange, who's the Executive Director of DENIVA. Sophie is a female Ugandan with 15 years of international development practice implementing civil society strengthening programs. She's the current executive director of a network of indigenous organizations called DENIVA, and she's an organizational development specialist, a facilitator, a network weaver, and a certified trainer for mobilizing support and local fundraising. She loves traveling, nature walks, swimming, cooking, and interacting with people. Those all sound like good things to me. And she's going to talk about culturally and contextually appropriate and effective MEL systems. After that, we'll move to Alison McKinley, who's the evidence and learning design lead as part of the Shifting the Power programme at Comic Relief. Alison started her career as a nurse in the UK, Africa, and South America before moving into health programme management. Her master's in demography and health brought her focus into more data research and learning as both a practitioner and a commissioner. And as a credited partnership broker and service designer, her interest is in combining traditional evaluation methods with more participatory, human-centered and partnership-based approaches. And she'll be talking to us about knowledge asymmetries and participation deficits. And then finally, we had a last minute change to our panelist. Unfortunately, one of our panelists was ill this morning or last night, and very kindly, Catriona Dejean from Tearfund has stepped in and taken her place. So we're really excited to have you here, Catriona, and hope that Anandita is feeling better soon. Catriona has over 20 years experience across the private, public and NGO sectors, and she's currently the Director of Strategy and Impact at Tearfund, which is an international NGO working across 50 countries, and she leads the organisational strategy, research and impact agenda. And she's also a member of INTRAC's Board of Trustees since 2018. So great to have you all 4 here. So I'm going to put myself on mute and pass over to you, Franck, where we're going to hear from you for about 5 minutes. And as I said at the beginning, please do post any questions that you have in the chat, because we're going to run through the presentations back to back, but then there'll be a question and answer opportunity straight away after.
Great, thank you very much, Kate, and hi everyone. It's a very great pleasure to be on this platform. As being communicated, I will be discussing the issue of community-led monitoring and evaluation. And it's quite interesting to have such a conversation when we are discussing about shifting the power. We know that this is not a very easy or comfortable conversation to have. And I would like to start with a statement I made at my previous communication as part of the webinar series by INTRAC, that I appreciate the platform and opportunity to discuss such issues and to look at different ways of approaching our development initiatives. But that being said, I will have to be very open and acknowledge the fact that some of the conversations we are having are not really comfortable conversations, but they are really about finding alternative ways to approach our development initiatives and intervention. So when we talk about shifting the power, clearly we are acknowledging to a very high extent that there are power asymmetries, and that needs to be addressed. And so what does that mean? We are looking at colonial power, political power, institutional power, right? And we are also looking definitely at financial or resource power, who has and who does not have the resources. And we are also considering aspects pertaining to knowledge power or expert power. You know, sometimes evaluators or consultants, you know, conducting the process of the evaluation are assumed to have knowledge over the people that they are evaluating. And we also have cultural power and communal power. And I think for us, particularly in this segment of the conversation that I'm bringing about is really to looking at the latter, which is really about the people who is at the center of the process of change or development. Monitoring and evaluation is being regarded as one of the most emerging practice of our time, of our era, and for some reason it seems to be more of a recent development practice. However, there are evidences that monitoring and evaluation has been part of traditional ways of people governing themselves and assessing how they are progressing. Kusek and Rist, for instance, recount that in ancient Egypt, about more than 5,000 years ago, that they had this ability to monitor the country's grain and livestock outputs, you know, using this innate practice of assessing and measuring how they were able to respond to the food crisis of that time. And this is to say that it is peculiar to every society, people, group, or community. So monitoring and evaluation is not necessarily, as we portray it, as so much of an expert practice that is only within the prerogative of a few people. Unfortunately, this is what we are projected to be. And I think as we are discussing shifting the power, we have to look at ways that we democratize the knowledge and simplify access to this so-called technical knowledge and expertise, so that it becomes more of a practice and a culture within our different circles in society. So, and just along the same thoughts, I also look at monitoring and evaluation less in response to resource allocation, right? And what I mean is we do not necessarily conduct a monitoring and evaluation and for the purpose of responding to the needs or the demand of who allocate the resources, right? Even though that can be justified in terms of providing accountability, it is not the primary reason for which we need to conduct monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation is primarily in respect to observing change. And given the fact that change is innate and inherent to every society, group, people, or community, it means that there is ownership of the change by different stakeholders, by different parties, by different entities within the development intervention area. And so what I'm very interested in this conversation is to look at the principles, the conduct, the products, and the use of what we call the community-led monitoring and evaluation. And a lot of thoughts come to mind. For instance, who instigates the evaluation process? Who owns it? And whose interest does it serve? We believe that for any monitoring and evaluation endeavor that must benefit the community that is receiving the intervention, it must be contextually relevant, culturally sensitive, it must be value-driven and community-owned. And so what do we mean by value-driven? In any community that receives an intervention, there are inherent values that this community uphold and lives by. And it is very important that no evaluation endeavor is conducted or undertaken without regard to the values that drive this community. And again, as I end my thoughts, any evaluation process that does not add value to the organization that carries the process is one that must be disregarded or discarded. What do I mean? There must be a value that is derived from the point of view of whoever conducts the process to ensure that it does not only serve for the purpose of accounting for resources, but it also enables development and growth within the organization. So pure M&A activities related to projects must be seen as non-inclusive and not enabling of the development of both the organization and the communities. So we have to look at it from a different paradigm. And I want to share a final example from the African Development Bank. We've been on one platform for conversation about their independent review mechanism. And they have shared a very good examples of a project in Uganda that was postponed just for the fact that the target communities' cultural and spiritual values were overlooked, and they had to house the process to consider the ways that some of those facts were affecting the community and provide redress to the project. So this is really to provide us some thoughts for reflection and discussion as we move on in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. That was great. I really like that idea of evaluation must add value to the process and enable organisational development and growth. I think that's something that we would all sign up to. Sophie, I'm going to pass over to you next, please.
Thank you so much, Kate. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Frank, for setting the pace for this discussion, and thanks to INTRAC for giving us the platform to have a conversation on how we shift the power, looking at monitoring and evaluation. Well, first of all, we need to understand the whole concept of shifting the power and where we're coming from. In no expert language, I'll put a disclaimer. I'm coming from a practitioner side and looking at what experiences working with indigenous organizations that keep struggling with monitoring and evaluation. And so looking at shifting the power, the whole concept is, from my understanding, is putting the local or the global south in charge of development, like the change. And so when you look back at monitoring and evaluation, way back, it has been a culture that monitoring and evaluation systems are designed in the north and downloaded in the south. Yeah. So we've seen donors coming. We have World Bank indicators. We have every donor with its indicators that comes and downloads down in the south where development is happening. So in a way, monitoring and evaluation, like Frank says, has been looked at as a control tool. Yeah. Also getting opening remarks alluded to this, that it's more of looking at output and accountability. And so the shift has to start from there. How do we look at multi-generational learning as a tool that is going to enable development to happen in the global south? Yeah, so one, the shift will happen when there is trust and partnership rather than control and mistrust that M&E has been looked at in the current state. Yeah. So we need to also ask, while we are doing monitoring and evaluation, whose results are we looking for? Whose results which change are we looking for? Is it for the donor or the communities that interventions are implemented in? Yeah, so the shift also starts from that kind of thinking, orientation. If the change is for the people that where programs are implemented, then there is need to have an inclusive process through which monitoring and evaluation indicators and systems are made, yeah, and have healthy partnerships. Now, there is need to have a conscious and deliberate departure from projectizing development. We all agree that development is taking a projectized model. We come for 2 years or 1 year, implement a project and leave. But also knowing that development doesn't happen, it's not cutting a stone, yeah? It takes a process. So how does development happen in a more progressive way? When we are talking about mindset change, mobilizing communities for change, how do we shift them from more of projectized as brief period programs to have kind of a gradual, empowering and transformative MEL system that will capture different phases of transformation and development, rather than looking at numbers, targets, we've reached this one, we want to reach so and so. Once it's done, development has happened. Development doesn't happen like that. And I think that's why we are having this conversation on how we shift power. Now, also to look at the background of M&E. Initially, most of the M&E systems have been designed for service delivery organization. For example, we are going to build schools, we're going to build hospitals, we're going to plant boreholes, increase access to water. But when you look at the new trend of, for example, in governance and democracy, you know, these are not like a school structure that you could see, yeah? So how then do we rethink designing monitoring and evaluation systems that capture the non-tangible investments, the non-tangible programs in communities that will tell the story of transformation and change? The other area that also Frank talked about is on how M&E is expertized. Yeah, there is M&E. I mean, we've all gone through this experience. With all due respect to the M&E experts here, I mean, these guys know their place. The M&E experts, they come to the room, they tell you, they show you log frames, they show you this, and after that, they go. They leave you in a very confused state. But you need to also know that when we're looking at change, it's the people that are going through a development process that will ably take charge of their story and be able to measure that. So if the shifting then has to happen in the way we look at monitoring and evaluation. Now, there's one key thing that I need to emphasize: the respect for the subsidiary principle. The subsidiarity principle, yeah, that people closest to the problem have the solution to this problem. And many times they effectively will tell the story of change that happens. Yeah. So we need to put context to monitoring and evaluation and learning, especially the learning bit. Yeah, if communities are empowered to tell their story, to count their change levels, then the shift will be realistic. We need to move out from the log frames. I think we already see the shift happening when there are theories of change that are coming in, that are more inclusive. But more to this is that we need to go down and work with communities. How do we empower communities to communicate their success? Then the challenge I have also with monitoring and evaluation and learning is that
Sophie,
it focuses on mainly.
Sorry
yes?
to come in. Can you start wrapping up? I'm sorry.
I'm on the last point.
Great.
Thank you. So just last 2 points. Communicating success. Monitoring and evaluation largely focuses on the success. How much are we achieving? What are we harvesting? What results are we harvesting? So focus, because it's also an accountability tool to the funder. Focus is put on the success, but can we start looking at MEL systems that focus also on failure and how we learn from the points of failure? And lastly is the language when we are reporting, and also the indicators. For example, when you look at the World Bank indicators, there are all these complexities in the wording, the language that is used in monitoring and evaluation. The first time I engaged with an M&E expert in my organization, way back in my former organization, they were talking of all these terms, the data bundles, the DQAs, they have all these acronyms. The language to a local organization deep in my village may not relate to this language. And sometimes how we write our reports doesn't fit in the language that is portrayed in the M&E. So one thing to also add is on how indigenous organizations or local communities can empower themselves to fit the global context, but also build confidence that they can actually receive the power that is shifting to them to inspire development. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sophie. Another great input, and I really liked your emphasis on the importance of trust and partnership, and then what you went on to say about who are the experts and who are we listening to. Really important contributions. Let me pass over to Alison now for the next insight. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks, Kate, and Sophie and Frank. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the participation asymmetries and deficits in the knowledge ecosystem, specifically focusing on this sector in international development. So I was going to think quickly a little bit about why it might happen and what it looks like, and then the impact this imbalance has and how we might redress it. So I'm using this kind of clunky knowledge ecosystem term as a bit of a catch-all for monitoring, evaluation, research and learning, as a huge and diverse set of activities, and we can't speak to the nuances of each of them here. So I'm generally talking about the production and consumption and application of knowledge. So things like using research and evaluations to inform an organizational strategy, doing user research to co-design a funding call, project and program level MEL, and obviously sharing and disseminating all of this knowledge. So why there might be participation asymmetries and deficits in the production and use of knowledge is a big topic in itself, and previous talk speakers have already touched on a lot. Others could speak to it much better, so I'm borrowing a little bit from other sources and thinking about this. For example, the book Modern Grantmaking talks about privilege as a set of unearned benefits given to people who fit into a specific social group. I would add to that power plays out as how this privilege manifests intentionally or unintentionally in the way knowledge is produced, consumed and applied in our sector. And additionally, Peace Direct talks about how much of this has been legitimized in inequitable processes and including the knowledge ecosystem, as in many other areas of our sector. So ultimately, the result is that local actors and right holders are often excluded, even though they are the ones most intended to benefit from the work of the sector. What this might look like then is that individuals have unequal access to setting learning agendas, accessing funding, participating in data giving, whether they are commissioners, practitioners like MEL professionals, experts, evaluators, M&E staff, or the local actors and rights holders themselves. All of this has implications about what happens all the way through the knowledge ecosystem. So that organisational strategy might be skewed away from the most impactful interventions if the evidence is biased. Funding calls might be less impactful if they're not founded in user engagement. And programme level monitoring, evaluation and learning may not measure what counts, so that real impact or even real harms are missed. So why is it important to address this? Well, firstly, I don't think anyone would disagree that there isn't a moral and ethical imperative for equitable participation. Additionally, there's some considerations specific to knowledge ecosystem. I think that inequitable participation weakens the quality of the evidence base of the sector, or at the very least, it makes it incomplete. So people look to evidence-based practice as an objective truth, but it's as subject to the same biases and inequities as everything else, and this can really reduce the quality of the knowledge that it produces. Therefore, citing this evidence base can really deter constructive critique of its quality and the quality of the decisions that informs around funding and programming and what happens. By lessening the quality, then this inequitable participation can also lessen the value for money of investment in it. Perhaps this money would be better spent elsewhere, which is more of a question. And finally, knowledge is more likely to be used where it's trusted, and trust is best gained through participation and co-production. So inequitable participation may actually lessen the use of knowledge and ultimately limit its pathway to have any impact. Basically, an important and equitable knowledge ecosystem would build a better understanding of global challenges and better enable all of us to respond to them. So finally, a few things about how we might all make a change and contribute to that change. Wherever we appear in this ecosystem, we can all be part of a solution with a bit of courage to question existing practice and humility to know our own biases and unlearn and change. So as those with significant power, commissioners and donors need to make real strides to share this and to model that humility. So bean count when it's helpful, fund and use data on who's at the table and use it to improve diversity and inclusion. Make sure that the knowledge production that funders and commissioners resource is ethical and inclusive. So engage stakeholders in defining questions, maybe include questions of how historical and structural issues have contributed to the problem under focus. Listen to what right holders have to say. Don't commission work which just says the same again with an apparently more authoritative voice. Try hard to reach and contract locally based practitioners. Choose them based on their ability to work with participants and not their grammar or English in their proposal. Trust them to select the most appropriate methods, resource the participation because it does need time and money. Commit to sharing good and bad findings. I think Sophie alluded to learning from failure as well, and make these accessible. So again, resource translation and don't just ask for a dusty old report. Where it's within your remit, ensure equitable citation of everyone involved in knowledge production. So this maybe is more specific to research, but ensure open access data, shared intellectual property, no paywalls. Ultimately, these otherwise skew the evidence base available towards quite a northern and anglophone publication bias. Practitioners, so researchers and evaluators, M&E staff, to some extent have to play the game to get work, especially private individuals, researchers and evaluators, but there are still ways you can push back sometimes where this work appears to counter best practice. So, for example, know what purpose the work serves and challenge or even refuse it if you can, where it appears self-serving or otherwise lacks integrity and transparency. And since data collection methods reflect the kind of knowledge that is perceived to be important and to count, practitioners might be in a position to advocate for more participatory approaches which show participants as empowered agents with a story to tell and not just sort of passive subjects to extract data from. and ensure a diversity of voices are included in knowledge that you're producing. Participants themselves, just to caveat that the onus must not be on those disenfranchised from systemic inequity to solve a problem, but people giving data or local actors involved in the conduct of knowledge production can certainly ensure to know and demand their rights to be fully informed before consenting to participate, know the purpose and use of whatever knowledge is produced, evaluation, M&E, etc. Asked to validate the findings before they're published and ensure they represent an accurate and more appropriate and empowered portrayal of their reality. To summarize then, as a sector, I think we have to recognize that knowledge is political and be comfortable with the discomfort that Frank mentioned and the productive tensions that arise when different ways of working and thinking come together. These are often the spaces where opportunity for change really happens. And so we need to put our shared goals for a positive social impact first and use these opportunities to make more fundamental progress towards a more equitable knowledge ecosystem, which will better enable us to reach these goals.
Thank you, Alison. That was great. Really good to both have the whole system mapped out, but also things that different actors in the system could think about, and how we can all work in our different ways to sort of challenge and change the system with humility and unlearning. Let me pass over to Catriona for our last input.
Thank you, Kate, and it's great to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. And so I am stepping in at the last minute, but I just want to say I'm coming here, on behalf of many of my colleagues around the world who I work with in Tearfund, because what I want to be able to share is some of the pragmatic and practical things that we have been doing over these past 10 years to really think about that shifting of the power of our data, of what it means to measure transformational change. So as I say, I'm here on behalf of them. Many of them take the credit for a lot of what I'm going to share. And also within that, a lot of it is about our partners that we work with. So Tearfund is an organisation that has worked with partners since its inception over 54 years ago. It's very much part of our DNA. We're very much led by the partner agenda, led by the needs of communities. And so as we entered into this journey, particularly over these past 10 years, of thinking about how do we measure change, it was really important that we built in that ethic, that kind of framework, and that foundation of who we are as an organisation, how we work. Tearfund is quite an influencing organisation. We work through more influencing type of initiatives, mobilisation of churches and communities around the world. We're a knowledge broker, catalysing and facilitating others. I'm often a critical friend, walking alongside with partners, walking alongside movements, leading, participating in those different movements. So the way in which we work, we do projects, but we also do more sort of systemic kind of process orientated work. So when I stepped into this role 11 years ago, there was this challenge of how do we collectively measure this? And I remember really everyone coming to me saying, oh, you've arrived and you're going to help us measure this impact, to which it was, no, this is our agenda. We're working on this together. And over these years, just really exploring together some of the questions that have been coming up through our conversations with partners, questions that we see even in communities themselves, those being around, what does it really mean to measure transformational change? What does whole life change look like? What does it mean to flourish and thrive in different contexts? And how do we know that the initiatives, the projects, the work that we are doing as a partner or as Tearfund or collectively is actually leading to that transformational change and poverty reduction? So this started us on a journey to create what we've called the Light Wheel, which is a framework which we've created to look at holistic change. And this has been such an exciting journey. And we now have that Light Wheel framework and set of tools which has been used across 20 different countries in so many different and exciting ways. And I just really wanted to highlight three kind of areas from that, which I think pick up on some of the points that Frank and Sophie and Alison alluded to. And really want to focus in on openness, ownership, and optimism. So the first one around openness. So in this journey of really understanding what does change look like, it has been an innovative co-design space over these 10 years. So what has that looked like? Well, we a collective group of people within Tearfund, which included people from the UK and also from outside of the UK, came together and really looked at different evidence. We ideated together, we looked at external evidence, looking at well-being, looking at some of the work coming out of the University of Bath on pathways out of poverty, looking at some of the evidence around well-being. And what we started to unpack that. We looked at our own internal learning, we had conversations with partners, we drew on our evaluations, we drew on the conversations we were in. And so we started to co-design the framework, the light wheel. We called it the light wheel, and it stands for Learning Impact Guide for Holistic Transformation. We don't tend to use that long name, but we very much see it as a way of shining light into the areas of work that we're doing. Communities themselves see it as a way to shine the light into the areas that are working well, the areas that are not working so well. We took the co-design of this into different contexts. You know, we had colleagues and partners in India working with us on this, colleagues and partners in Myanmar, in Africa, in Latin America, helping us to trial and test this together. So it's really been a really open space and a really exciting space for us to build this together. And as part of our own learning, we have just commissioned a consultant to work with us to look at how it's been implemented and how it's been used. And that is really what she's come out with and said, this real openness to work together, this ability to draw different perspectives into the design of how we're going to measure what we're measuring, what changes, you know, what changes are important to who, and whose data is this. So it's been really exciting. And I think just linked with that is the whole issue of ownership. So we've really seen this ownership across the organisation, across our partners, and with communities as well. And I just wanted to share some feedback from the consultant. And she said, you know, there is real local ownership over the process of data collection, the commitment to improve the process, and the local use of data. So let me just give you an example of what that might look like. We have an example from Bangladesh where, you know, the light wheel has been used in order to get that ownership. The light wheel has been translated into local languages. And so the local churches who we very much work with are eager to get hold of that data. So we are really seeing communities wanting that data. We've also seen where that data has started to inform conversations that communities are having with local authorities. So in Tanzania, for example, one community used the data to be able to advocate for new infrastructure from their local government. So it's really owned, it's really well used, there's a real hunger for the data, and that's what the consultant said. She's never seen a sort of a way and approach of getting local-led data in a way that people are actually proud of the data. That's what she said, people are proud of the data. And so one of the things that we are working on is how do we support and skill up people for doing their own data analysis. So we have a household survey that sits behind the tool, the framework, and the many other tools, but the household survey is one way which we can collect maybe more robust data. And we have data out there, there's data in communities, and one of our challenges as an organisation is to understand how can we get some access to that data to further learn with the communities and with the churches and partners that we work with. So I guess one of the third areas which I'm really seeing is optimism. So we've heard various issues and challenges being presented today. But I think what we've really seen over these past 10 years is a real optimism. There is this real desire to do things differently. And I think because we've all stepped into this, our partners, our churches, ourselves, we've stepped into this in a different way. We've used this time to learn and grow together. We've looked at ways of measuring, we've looked at ways of understanding what change means in these different contexts. I think there's an optimism. I think, you know, the very fact that we are seeing people proud of the data, the very fact that communities, you can go into a community around the world and you can see an image of the light wheel, so a spider diagram which helps to map the journey of change. You can go into different communities around the world and you can see communities engaged in that and often come in and say, look what we have done. And they're not saying, look what Tearfund has done, but they're saying, look what we have done. And this is for us a really, really exciting space. So we have lots of work going on around this area. There's a lot more detail that I could share with you, but I just really wanted to share those 3 points really around openness, ownership, and optimism to set the scene for today.
Great, thank you, Catriona. And that's really nice to sort of hear how MEL can promote ownership and the optimism that you're feeling through being part of that. So many interesting themes and so many questions that have come through to me in the chat. So I'm not sure if I'm going to do these as much justice as I would like, but a key theme that seemed to come through quite a lot was the sort of way the industry of MEL has become mystified and has a sort of expertise around it. And I wondered if panel members, maybe starting with you, Frank, could talk sort of a bit more practically about what we could do to demystify MEL and re-legitimize MEL. Like, what practical actions could we take? And that might involve language, it might involve thinking through who is defining the MEL, but if you could share some ideas that you have in that.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate, and thanks to all my colleagues on the panel. Very interesting thoughts there. So what can we do to demystify monitoring, evaluation, and learning? Very interesting. When I assumed office in my current position as the head monitoring, evaluation, and learning at WACSI, one of the things that I started doing is to organize in-house training for all of the staff members of the organization, and to revisit the basics of monitoring and evaluation, use a very simple language that is accessible by everyone. And it starts from there. It doesn't have to be too complex. It doesn't have to be too technical. We just have to make it accessible. And it's really to do with the dialectics and aligning it with the culture of the organization, ensure that there is this aspect of human-centered design or approach, and have everyone around the table. I strongly believe that any monitoring, evaluation, and learning endeavor that does not seek to build an organization and create ownership across board within the organization is one that is disempowering, and that must not be endorsed or supported, right? There's really no value in seeing ourselves as agents of development interventions for just satisfying one peculiar need at one given time if it does not build the institution, if it does not build the community that we are serving. So I really believe that there's a lot to do with making the language very simple and having this circle of sharing. And in that spirit, we all have to see ourselves, whether you are looking at the person allocating the resources, those implementing and those receiving the intervention. We have to promote horizontal learning as opposed to a vertical learning approach. Horizontal learning will give space and priority for peer learning, for exchange learning, for networking, for peer mentoring, and having that open mind for reflection. Because definitely the people at the heart of the development intervention have a broader perspective of what change means to them. And just to use this example from the African culture, what we call the Ubuntu is really about the relationship. How do we see a person-to-person relationship with others in building that communal living, that ways of supporting the community? If you step in to conduct a monitoring evaluation activity and you do not see yourself, you, the evaluator or the agency, as an extension of the community and trying to learn within that frame, it will be very difficult for you to make any inroads in your intervention. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sophie, I wondered if I could go to you, thinking about what you shared with us, but then also what Alison and Catriona came in afterwards. If we had a system that was built with the local actors and right holders as the experts in evaluation, what would that look like? How would that system look?
Thank you so much, Kate. That's quite a complicated question to answer. But well, it takes time to explore different options. But that system would look like some of the indicators I'll look at, yeah? Having a system that is not fixed, like we have the log frames, these systems that are in place. And we have more of a kind of empowering system where people, for example, one that communicates change in the way it is perceived and the way it happens. How can we move out from narrative reporting, for example, within M&E, and having a system that is using more of storytelling, videography? People just have people capture people's voices telling their story. Yeah. So having a more human-centered system in place, and how it will look like having people actually participating in telling their development journey and development story. And then, yeah, participation, a system that enables participation, a system that is giving platform for people to tell their own story, but a system that is also sensitive to the context, where people's cultures and traditions or way of doing things are put into perspective.
That's great, thank you. I know I'm putting you all on the spot. It's a horrible role of the chair, is to make everyone else feel a bit uncomfortable, I think, but I'm trying to do it in a gentle way. Alison, I was going to go to you next and ask, given that you are sitting now in Comic Relief in a donor organisation, funder organisation, could you talk through an example where you've sort of explicitly worked to shift the power in some of the evaluation and evidencing work that you've been commissioning, and what that meant in practice? Like, what were the things that you actually did and what did you learn through that?
Yeah, well, you have made me feel very uncomfortable. So this is the bit I don't like, is responding really, really quickly to something. But there is a sort of live example now, which I think some of you on the call will know about, where we're trying to two examples. One is the program I'm working on, which is called Shifting the Power, and it's looking at civil society strengthening in Ghana, Malawi, and Zambia. Franck is also involved in that, so can also add or speak to what I'm doing. This is really early on in the program, so we're learning a lot, and I speak more as myself than Comic Relief here in what I'm learning. But I think as I alluded to in what I said in the talk, commissioners and donors have to be really proactive and intentional about making strides to demonstrate how they're trying to do it, and be really humble to shift power, and be really humble and open to admit getting it wrong, not doing it very well. So there's a lot learning about the process as well as the practice of what we're actually doing. As part of that, I'm also increasingly thinking about what we can do better to really show that intentionality. I think the default within the system for very historical and well-founded reasons is that there's a bit of skepticism if donors and commissioners appear to trying to do something. I think we have to, as donors and commissioners, be very honest about our motivations for shifting power, and then be very clear about why and how we're trying to do it, so that it is perceived to be genuine, to build that trust, which I think has been alluded to in some of the conversations. On a very practical level, the second example is around a piece of work I'm involved in, but there's parallel pieces of work that others are leading on around commissioning and trying to commission more locally. And I know INTRAC does a lot of work as well on localizing consultancies. There's very practical things there that, you know, we are all, everyone here on this call is busy in their daily work, and we sort of default to habit and heuristics and shortcuts just to get things done. So on a very practical level, how to reach people that we don't reach? How do you advertise to audiences that you haven't met before? How do you make sure that you don't just find a partner and then go to them every time because you know them? So use that elite capture of finding a local partner, but always the same one. I mean, how do you build new networks and change your internal standard operating procedures so that you're selecting based on ability to work with local actors and rights holders, and not the normal criteria on the template, which really question when you're reading it. I understand how this is written in my language. Am I scoring it unfairly because of that? So there's a lot of like systemic and very personal things that you just have to constantly question and ask yourself and ask your colleagues and challenge as well.
Thank you. That felt very like you had plenty of time to think about it. It was a great answer, so thank you. And then finally, I wanted to know from you, Catriona, like what could we do collectively as different people working across the sector, but especially as international NGOs and those supporting civil society, to make change happen, to enable change to happen?
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for the question. I think even just in that question where you say as NGOs and those supporting civil society, I think this is about us doing this together. And I think that's one of the narrative shifts that we need to really be thinking about, is what does change look like for whoever, wherever we sit, you know, and have a change in that narrative of how we approach some of this, and change that sort of power dynamic, I think, that sometimes comes in our conversations around monitoring and evaluation. So for me, there's something about our language, there's something about our approach, the stance we take in. And as I know, you know, many of our NGOs have colleagues and partners around the world. So we have such a collective body of knowledge, expertise, input, information, insight, that we really need to, I think, stop some of the things we are doing, really reflect on what we are doing, review what we're doing, and be open and be willing to be challenged, and to go into those difficult spaces, and to really say, what have we actually done here? What have we achieved together? And where do we want to go? Setting a new vision for where we want to go together. And we've heard a lot about some of the principles or the things we would like to be able to do. For me, I think there's something how, you know, individually within our NGOs, individually within our organisations, with civil society all together, how do we set that vision for what this really looks like? And how do we start to then learn together? How do we, you know, accept that we will make mistakes along the way, but how do we draw on things that have already gone before? And I can see some great examples and comments in the chat. So for me, you know, this is about us all embodying the L of the monitoring, evaluation and learning. And I think this openness to say, well, we've got things wrong, and the openness to say, well, where do we want to go together, and who needs to be on that journey as we step into this. So I think it's a call to us all to be open to, you know, open to be challenged, open to let go, open to bring new people in, open to create space. And I think it's something about listening as well. So the L for me is learning and listening. I think so often we say that we listen, but do we actually listen? Do we listen to hear the things we want to hear, or do we listen to actually understand? And I think that's everyone's got to do that in this space.
Great, thank you. I think that those were all really additional helpful insights from you all. I'm now going to ask people to go into breakout rooms to have a bit of space to talk about some of the things that we've heard with each other. So that's going to happen automatically. We're going to be put into breakout rooms of between 5 and 8 people, I think, in each room. Please do stay and participate in the breakout rooms, because we've set up the rooms, and if you all leave, then you might have one poor person on their own having to talk to themselves and answer these questions. So it'd be great if you can stay. We've got 3 questions that we'd like you to discuss in the breakout rooms, and then which have just been put up in the chat here. And then we've got this virtual board where there is a link as well in the chat, and we'd like you to post your thoughts and answers to those questions on that virtual board. And you can also sort of annotate other people's answers. You can put thumbs up and comments back on other people's answers. So please do that as you do your chats. So I'm going to stop speaking in a second, and you're going to be asked to join a meeting room. When you get into the meeting room, please do put on your camera, introduce yourself quickly, say where you work and where you're based, but then please move on to sort of talking about the 3 questions that we've got, thinking about your own experiences and what you think the challenges and opportunities are to shift power through MEL. And then we'll come back for a final plenary after that. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hi, everyone. I hope you had good discussions in your breakout room. So we've got just 10 minutes left of the event now. What I'm going to do is we had a few facilitators from INTRAC that were in a few of the rooms. And so I'm going to ask them to just feedback briefly about the types of discussions that were happening in those rooms. Please do also keep looking at the Easy Retro board that we've posted the link to. And you can keep posting things there as you hear back from the INTRAC facilitators, but I'll go to Paul to hear a couple of insights from your group.
Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me? Is that good? Yeah, I can see you nodding. Brilliant. We had a really good discussion. There's a good group of us there. Just very quickly, because we haven't got a huge amount of time, just to highlight, we start off talking about sort of power and what we mean by power. And you know, it's very difficult sometimes to think about what power are we talking about in terms of sort of micro, macro structures of power. And we talked about sort of power being hierarchical. I think that linked very much to some of the earlier discussion in the panel. And actually, when it comes to things like learning and that L in MEL, if you like, it feels that that's very much sort of vested at the top in the hierarchy, and it's about sort of you know, feeding into investment and other processes. But actually, it's very difficult to ensure that that kind of learning filters down through organisations, but also that it's actually designed by participants or people that the actual the projects are actually speaking to and involving, if you like. There was a discussion about data and knowledge management systems, and I think that struck people, that conversation from earlier, to what are the systems, and we certainly need to change that and make them more sort of context specific or right for different people. And getting that right, and you know, moving away from things like log frames might be a very good start in helping to shift power. And then just finally, I just wanted to highlight one other point which has struck me that came out in the discussion around sort of tangible versus intangible approaches, so that we need to think more conceptually about these sorts of things, you know, in terms of intangible concepts of values. And I think that struck me about what Frank was talking about, really trying to explore and understand that, and that things like time, particularly with projects that are very time bound, means that people are quite quick to focus on the quick wins related to sort of tangible benefits, rather than thinking about these longer term changes, which I think is very important. And you know, the question about time there. So I'll just stop there, Kate. Thanks very much, and it was a really good discussion.
Great, thank you, Paul. Willemijn, how was your group?
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, we had a very rich discussion as well. We were quite a bigger group, so we weren't able to systematically go through all the questions. But our discussion started a bit about levels of trust, and that trust can be a challenge in shifting the power, historically and very culturally embedded in colonization. We spoke a bit about tools, and when we create more equitable partnerships and monitoring, evaluation and learning tools, there should perhaps be more a drive from the South and like a leadership from the South in terms of developing these tools. And there was a bit of a debate and a discussion around whether we give enough space to do so, and to what extent we can actually shift power when funding is clearly still coming from the global north. How much can we actually progress on this aspect when we can't really discuss and address the fact that the financial flow is and will likely remain from global north to global south? We also spoke a bit about participatory approaches, that they do require also closing the feedback loop, and that's clearly a gap. So we cannot focus on just designing participatory approaches, but then taking information from the community without feeding back towards the end. And what do we do with all the data that is gathered and collected? Many more in the discussion. I want to maybe finish with one question, which was an internal question that we also have at INTRAC, like how much are you willing to be uncomfortable about your own position of power, but also how much are we technically able to shift the power without jeopardizing our own very existence as organizations? I think that was a very relevant question put forward in my group discussion. I probably forgot a lot, so please add to the board.
Yeah, please do add to the board, but that was great, thank you. Alistair?
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so likewise, we had quite a big group and loads of really good points, but I'll just mention a few. So one was all about intention versus commitment. So we see a lot of really good intention from organizations to shift the power and work in a more sort of localized way, but the actual commitment sort of becomes lacking, and different pressures, so resources, time pressures, donor sort of constraints and demands, and that in reality, lots of people and organizations end up sort of taking shortcuts or reverting back to old ways of working. So how to challenge that. And then some of the other challenges also sort of internal systems of MEL. What is like the origin of the organization's MEL approach, and how early has a local partner been involved in that? And what sort of level of input have they had, what opportunity have they had to sort of be involved from the design phase. And then on the opportunity side, Peter mentioned that in Ghana, he sort of witnessed in the last 7 years like a huge growth of young people really interested in working in MEL. And he sees this as a really sort of promising opportunity, and engagement with MEL is a sort of shift from traditional sort of mainstream programming work. And finally, Devika mentioned that it's all very good and well having these really important conversations, but unless we're also sort of inviting power brokers, donors, and sort of leaders at INGOs to sort of these conversations to be uncomfortable, like Caroline mentioned, the impact is limited. Back to you.
Have we lost Kate? Well, dropped out. In which case, I think there was maybe just one more feedback from one of the groups. Who's still to go? I think that's Alison.
Alison, yeah, me, yeah. Thanks, Paul. So, yeah, we had an interesting discussion in a smallish group, which is great. I think we started with talking about this issue of how to capture the hard to measure intangible things like cultural taboos and norms that are really hard to quantify, but also express in the data. So how do you actually measure change in these areas? And we got on to then discussing really, I think, the importance of participatory approaches, qualitative methods that focus on storytelling as being really important ways of understanding what actually does matter to people and what is really changing for people. And we were talking about how best to use that language of stories. We also discussed a bit that, there is a lot of pressure, as was mentioned in some of the by some of the panelists, for positive stories that are used for marketing, rather than genuinely used for reflection and learning, and that often we feel pressure, even if we're using sort of storytelling methods, we need, there's pressure to present them really in a well-written way, in English, and so on, in ways that are really geared towards donors or fundraisers, rather than sort of them being really used for people to learn from. I think we also just touched on some methods like outcome harvesting. We talked about a bit more significant change as well, methods that we felt are not necessarily, they're not really silver bullets, but they can solve many of the challenges. They can be owned by people, by the people experiencing the changes. They're qualitative, story-based approaches. But I think even with using some of these approaches, which we think have potential, there's still pressure. We acknowledge there's still a lot of pressure from donors for numbers. And just reflecting a bit what the last group said as well, we think that for these approaches to become more even more recognized, valued, we need to influence donors and commissioners to recognize, place more value in those approaches than the quantitative data.
Thanks, Alison, and apologies, my internet went down briefly there, but I'm back. Sorry, everyone, we are running a few minutes over. I hope you'll bear with us and hear the last sort of wrapping up session, but obviously if you need to leave, we completely understand, and we thank you for coming. I'm going to pass over to Catherine, who's also from INTRAC, who's just going to give us sort of some final reflections. I see that a couple of people have posted their feedback from their groups in the chat here. Please carry on doing that. It's great to collect it all, and we will be sharing everything later. But I will pass over to Catherine to talk about opportunities and challenges for the sector and key reflections and takeaway from today.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. I think to start, I need to probably reflect back on the feedback that our trustee Smruti Patel made at our first Shifting the Power event back in March, in which she asked us all to reflect on our own power as an individual before then sort of looking to see how we can then engage with the change process. So I need to say that I'm conscious and very aware of the fact that it's a real privilege to be asked to do a summing up for this event, but also it's an incredibly difficult job because you've all brought really valuable and diverse perspectives to these discussions. We've had a lot of really rich discussion. I will do my best to capture some of the key points. I'm sure I will miss an awful lot, but please sort of do allow me to do my best for you. I guess telling a bit of a story, which is one of the themes that has come through, that monitoring and evaluation is not a recent development. It's been part of our sort of culture and society across the world for a very long time. But we've created a system which has asymmetries in it: cultural, expert power, the financial imbalances, institutional power relations, political and colonial asymmetries are all affecting how we have engaged with monitoring, evaluation, and most critically learning. And that's reflected in a lot of what has come through is obviously the need to challenge those asymmetries, to move away from this idea that it is a north-south transfer of systems, to being much more based on trust and partnership, genuine partnership, and valuing people's perspectives and lived experiences. Even the language that we've created around MEL is excluding many people, the use of acronyms, the language which we used for reporting in our use of technical terms. The observation from Sophie as well, that this has also come through a service delivery lens, whereas change processes reflect governance and democratic processes, which are much more complex. They don't fit neatly into that service delivery perspective. I particularly like Frank's observation that shifting the power is an uncomfortable conversation, and that where that feeling of discomfort is where we need to really think and challenge ourselves. It's highlighting the issues that we need to really engage with to try and move MEL into something that's more valuable. And the main message, I think, for me that has come through is about MEL needing to really legitimise local knowledge and experience, and tie it very strongly to power asymmetries and ownership. That MEL is about telling the story of change as a journey, not just about being accountable to the funder or the organisation that is sort of actively doing the work, and how important it is for us to reflect on the question of who is involved in designing and taking part in the monitoring, evaluation and learning activities, about how that information is being used, what form that information takes, and how accessible it is to people who have contributed their experiences to that pot of knowledge. Frank was very persuasive that MEL must have a value, that it needed to be both an inclusive and an enabling process, but it also needed to promote growth and development within the organisations and individuals who are involved with it, that it needed to be values driven, really community owned, to be sensitive to the context, to acknowledge those cultural and spiritual values of the people who are on that change journey. Central, as I say, to creating that change that came through was building trust, the trust between all the different sort of moving parts within the MEL system, the knowledge ecosystem, and that needs also to be us being confident and letting go of putting local communities much more central to the process, to give them power in that sense, to take that more humanist approach. The other element that came through around sort of the idea of change processes versus project timelines, that there is real tension there, that the journey, it's a journey and it takes time. And really the perspectives that we should be valuing are the perspectives of those communities who are on that journey that we are contributing to. And that is something that that we need to think about how best to bring those stories in, whether that's in the form of the tools that we use to capture them, whether it is through video storytelling, something that is different from our current practice, whether that is through working with different people, expanding our networks, developing relationships and supportive relationships with people who can draw out those community perspectives, and making sure that we are asking ourselves how we can value perspectives better than we currently are, and also not to be scared of failure. I think learning and listening were two things that came out. And the idea that successes, yes, it's good to understand successes, but in order to really get a better understanding of how we can make a positive difference to support a change, it really has to be about acknowledging our role in that process, our biases, to listening to other perspectives and learning to value those perspectives properly. We are all part of the system, so we all have a part to play in that change. And I think today's session, we've heard lots of examples of how this might happen, very practical examples of how other organisations are trying to put that into practice, of how that sort of learning and listening element is being incorporated into MEL. We've looked at how you could promote more horizontal learning, challenge elite capture, the link between MEL and organisational learning and development, trust and relationships, and really challenging ourselves and letting go. I think were for me things that I will take away from that. As I say, I doubt I've captured everything, but that's the best I can do. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. And thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone and for all the comments in the chat. We asked you to share your keywords. And so we're just sharing back with you what words came up in terms of how you're feeling today. We will be, we've recorded this event and we will be sharing the video from the event, but also doing a whole series of communications coming out of this. It's a topic that is really important for INTRAC that we're really thinking about and working on. So this has been helpful just to inform our own thinking, but also hopefully to take forward some action together in different ways. There's some more blogs on our website, on the INTRAC website, both from people within INTRAC, but also part of our wider network with different angles on shifting power through MEL. So I encourage you to look at those as well. And yeah, thank you everyone. Thanks for those of you who stayed to the end, and we will be sharing with you shortly.